Welcome to this workshop on pollinators, presented by the Master Gardeners of Nevada County. Here is our workshop presenter, Bonnie Brott.
I want to thank everyone for showing up on this very rainy morning. I hope you're all nice and warm and having some coffee in your house. My name, can you see the slides, Sylvia?
Yes, it looks great.
Great. Okay, my name, as Sylvia said, is Bonnie Brott. I've been a Nevada County Master Gardener for 16 years, and I studied entomology at UC Davis, where I graduated with my entomology degree in really long time ago in 1972, and have been enjoying using my entomology background to help the Master Gardeners and help the gardeners of Nevada County. I also spent 40 years as a research scientist in biochemistry research labs in San Diego and at UC Davis. So now being retired is a treat, and it's a joy to be able to enjoy some time at home. Not quite as much as I have been the last year. I'd rather be out in the community, but that will come. So let's enjoy the pollinators and move ahead now. Okay, you know what? There we go. All right, why should we care about pollinators? At least 1 out of every 4 mouthfuls of food that we take in requires or benefits from a pollinator. Those crops across the country, thousands and thousands of them. And pollinators help to keep plant communities healthy because they serve to pollinate the crops, pollinate the local plants, keep the genetics of the plant community out with enough diversity to keep them healthy, because pollination is sexual reproduction, and that keeps the plant genetics in enough diversity. Pollinators are therefore central to all of our lives, all of the lives of humans and the lives of other wildlife, from bugs to bears. Now, crops that need pollinators. Here is a list. I know it's a little bit small, but I'm hoping with your screens that you can see them all. And maybe, you know, you don't love buckwheat or cabbage, or, you know, currants or chestnuts, but take a look at all of this huge list of plants that need pollinators. And I'm sure on there, you're gonna find something you really love. So that's one huge reason why we need to protect the pollinators and encourage them. Here's sort of a selection of some of the pollinators that we have here in Nevada County. And I'm going to introduce you to most of these and explain their role in the pollinator tree that we have. And we will start with the most famous. This is the honeybee, the European immigrant, who is now everywhere on the planet with the possible exception of Antarctica. But the rest of the country, the rest of the world is basically colonized everywhere with honeybees. They were brought in to this country by our ancestors who came over in the early 1600s, and with them, they brought their apple trees. They, of course, loved their apples, and when they brought apples to these shores, they discovered that the local native pollinators weren't as good at pollinating their apples as the bees that they were used to at home, the European honeybees. So shortly afterward, in these little creatures, these little things called bee skeps, which is sort of the antique version of the beehive, they brought bees to this country to help pollinate their apples and other crops. And now they have moved from coast to coast, and they're extremely gregarious. Just about every possible situation where you can find them, you will find them. Right here on the back legs is where they carry their honey and, nectar and pollen that they are out collecting in the flowers. They sort of smash it all together and make it into a little ball and carry it on their back legs. Sorry. So that they can then bring it back to the hive and use it to feed the young. Now, those golden balls of pollen on the leg of that previous bee are what you will usually see when you see them out foraging. But it isn't just gold-colored pollen. It can also be red and white and blue, depending on the color of the pollen that they're collecting, the color of the flowers, and depending on a lot. And that's a very pretty picture. I thought I had to show you guys that. So all the way from the days of ancient Egypt, honeybees have been used, have been domesticated, as it were, and you can see them, pictures of them on the walls of the pyramids, on various different places that indicate that our ancestors did prize the honeybees and their honey as a real treasure. Now, they are social insects, and there are two reasons why they are very, very special to us as opposed to any other pollinator. Their hives live a long time. They can be managed and moved around by beekeepers. They have a social structure: queen, workers, drones. The workers are all females, the drones are males, and they can be trucked even from one side of the country to the other for large-scale pollination efforts. California benefits from this enormously, and I will tell you all about that later. They add a huge amount of money, billions of dollars, to the already huge billion-dollar ag industry in this country every year. The other thing that makes them special is that they make honey, a very important crop that is sold in this country and most others as well. Very few other pollinators make honey, and only one other is a social insect, which is a pollinator found in this area, and makes only enough honey for their own offspring. So not enough for us to harvest more than our share, which is sort of what we do with honeybees. Now, this is what honey beekeeping used to be. For the pollination of crops back in the day, they would have honeybee boxes, honeybee hives next to the crops, and there they would stay and be used for pollination and also for collecting honey. But nowadays, this is what we see. This is how crops are being pollinated. The biggest example that I can give you is the California almond crop. Currently, the industry requires about 2 million hives every year, and California doesn't have anywhere near that many. So of the hives that we need, 80% or more of them come into the state from outside, from back east, from Midwest, from the north. 3,000 plus truckloads of hives come into the state every year just to pollinate the almonds. Now, this is basically the way that we are doing business. It's the way that we have designed our large-scale almond crop business, for example. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that one because it's a good example of all the crops that we are growing these days. Now, almonds require pollination at a specific time of year, and basically that's right now. It blooms for about 2 weeks. So if you ride down into the valley, which I actually did last week, they are now starting to bloom, and the honeybees have to be there. They are required. They are the only pollinator that we can bring in enough volume to pollinate this entire crop, which, as you saw a couple of slides ago, was over 1 million acres in this state alone. Now, bees are definitely stressed by the transport in those trucks, by the cold, drought, the types of food that they get. They aren't getting what they really need, which would be wildflowers. That would be the best way, but it simply can't happen in those trucks. And so they are fed man-made food. And of course, man is working very hard to get that food to be the best quality possible, but it isn't wildflowers. And so they do suffer to a certain extent by these problems. So dehydration and poor nutrition are basically inherent facts of the large-scale transport of these hives. Now, keep in mind, commercial beekeepers can charge a couple $100 or even more per hive to rent them out. And some keepers have tens of thousands of hives. So if you add it up, then you realize that this is a large-scale, high-dollar industry. And it's required for the way that we do business in the agricultural aspects of this country. There's nothing right now that we can do to substitute. They are the best at what they do. The cost of pollination to the growers has gone up over the years, and so they are very concerned about keeping the pollinators in good shape. Hives are often transported literally around the country for months, being rented out for services on a lot of different crops, not just almonds. Here's an example of some of the problems that the bees can encounter right here, and I hope you can see this arrow. We have an example of the varroa mites, which is a huge problem for the beekeepers and for the bees. This is the mites appearing on a pupa of a bee, a lot of them, and they suck the life out of that little critter, unfortunately. Here is a couple on an adult bee, and they also can transmit viruses. In particular, this one is called the deformed wing virus, and you can see the wings are curly and deformed and basically can't be used. This is another example of an adult with a very large mite on its back. This one can still fly, but it's not an ideal situation. So what can be done? This is a picture that I took down in the valley a couple of years ago of an almond grove, a really good sized one of those as far as the eye can see almond groves. And they try to keep the area underneath the trees cleaned out pretty well. At least at the time, they caused the trees to move in and out of those trees. First of all, to place the beehives, to pick them up at the end of the season, and to harvest the almonds. So this is a very sterile area. The bees really don't have, in many almond groves, they don't have a lot to feed on until the almonds flower, which is not very good for them. It's been hard to ask the growers to plant and to water wildflowers because they have enough trouble many years trying to find enough water for their trees. However, I did visit an almond grove who had a lot of help from Resource Conservation District, from the state, and they planted long rows, again, as far as the eye can see, just about, of wildflowers right next to the almond groves. And this was wonderful for the bees. The bees were extremely happy. And before you ask the question of whether or not the wildflowers take away the bees from their choice of pollinating the almonds, it really doesn't seem to have a negative effect on pollination success. Apparently, the bees really love the almond flowers. They must be a very special treat because the pollination of the almonds, as you can see, had really no problem even when the wildflowers were present. But before the almond flowers came out, having those wildflowers present was a real gift because the bees had enough to eat. So now we're going to move on and talk about the natives. This is a really important area of pollinators that we really can't forget, because before the immigrant pilgrims showed up back in the 1600s with their honeybees, the native bees were doing a great job of pollinating what we did have here at the time before apples and other types of crops were brought in. Here's an example of the squash bee, which does a great job of pollinating all kinds of squash. In particular, we have pumpkin. I want you to see this because this is the male flower with a long, skinny stem at the bottom. And over here, we have the female flowers. The flowers don't look really different, but down below, you have the beginnings of the pumpkin, which is forming below the female flower. You need to be able to tell the difference on your plants when you happen to have squash plants, because you need to know that you have female flowers present before you're going to be getting your various different types of crops developing. So I want you to remember that native pollinators have suffered a loss in numbers similar to the honeybees. They are affected by many of the same things. They are victims of the huge area of monoculture, and that means the crops down in the valley where you drive by, and they are, again, the same crop as far as the eye can see, and our heavy pesticide use. Honeybees and native pollinators are both negatively affected by the pesticide use and the huge areas of monoculture. Also, the lack of native or any flowering plants. In our gardens and farms, the negative aspect of having not enough flowering plants hurts both the natives and the honeybees. So if you are willing to plant pollinator plants, then it's good for both of them, and for butterflies as well, by the way. So the presence of native bees actually makes the honeybees better pollinators. That has been shown in various different scientific studies. I think it has a little bit to do with competition and probably other things as well, but it's a very good thing to know. So keep in mind that these are some of the crops that were present here in this country before the pilgrims came here. So the native pollinators are busy pollinating these particular crops, and often they do a better job than the European honeybees, which are considered the #1 pollinators around. And there are a lot of different reasons. For example, they will forage earlier or later in the day. They are up with the sun, and while the honeybees are still in the hive, they're out doing their job, and that will often make them more efficient pollinators for some crops. We'll discuss that a little bit more later. They will often forage in wetter, colder conditions, sort of like what we have outside right now, while the honeybees are still in the hive, keeping warm, drinking coffee, reading the paper. Okay, so many of the natives have a shorter, a smaller foraging range. So they don't go for miles as a honeybee will looking for pollen. They often don't leave their orchard. So the natives are better, more efficient pollinators for that given orchard, since they hang out there longer periods of time. They also manipulate the flowers and the pollen differently, so they can transfer more pollen. I'm going to tell you about that particular aspect in, it's called buzz pollination, a little later on when we talk about certain native pollinators. And they're often, again, more interested in the pollen rather than the honeybees, which will be interested in pollen because they need it as a protein source for their offspring, but they will then collect the nectar for making honey. And most native pollinators don't make honey, so they don't collect nectar. They collect the pollen. So let's get introduced to a few of our native pollinators present here in Nevada County. And here we are. The first one is the most recognizable except for the honeybee, and of the native pollinators, this one is the most important. It is the bumblebee. They're large, they're very good sized, fuzzy, easy to see, and they are the one local pollinator other than the honeybee that lives in a social colony. They have a queen and workers and drones, and they have a social hierarchy where some of them will take care of the babies and some will be out foraging. And so it's a very interesting colony. It is a smaller colony than a honeybee colony. The bumblebees might have a colony up to a couple hundred individuals by the end of the summer, whereas honeybees can have thousands or even tens of thousands of individuals in their colonies, their hives. Now, here's a really good example of why a bumblebee is such a good pollinator. It's got all that fuzz and it can collect pollen everywhere and move it from one flower to the next. Now, here is a different type of pollinator. It's called the leafcutter bee. And they don't carry their pollen on their back legs. They carry it in a brush that's underneath their abdomen. And that's where they carry the pollen and bring it back to their nest. And if you see these little almost perfect circular holes on especially the leaves of a rose bush or other leaves, that's probably the leafcutter bee cutting out little pieces of leaf to take back to their nest to enclose their babies. So here is Mama leafcutter bee cutting the little piece out and flying through the air with it rolled up in her clutches, and then taking it back to where she is building little cells one by one where she can lay her eggs, leave deposits of pollen for the babies to eat whenever they hatch. Now we have the carpenter bees. So with that name, you might get a little worried, but they do not feed on wood. They don't eat their way through the wood. They do nest in wood so that if wood happens to be a little bit crumbly, they can pull pieces of wood out of the way and make a pretty nice nest. And they are good pollinators, making use of that technique I mentioned a little while ago called buzz pollination. That is where the insect gets inside the flower and vibrates their body and actually shakes loose the pollen from inside the flower, and the pollen then showers itself onto them and often onto other flowers in the plant, so that they are very efficient pollinators using that particular method. They are also accomplished nectar robbers. You can see this one here. This is the male, the dad, and he is busy eating his way through the side of this flower because the flower is so small, he can't really fit in. So he eats a hole here in the back, and he can get nectar out of that hole or even a little bit of pollen without crawling through the flower. So he is robbing the nectar without even being kind enough to pollinate the flower. But that's why they call them nectar robbers. Mom, who is over here, the big black one, she feeds her young on pollen and nectar balls, which are left in the nest, like many other types of insects do. Here we have a digger bee. This is a common critter in Nevada County and often recognized by this little, it's not as big as a gopher hole because it's tiny. It's only just a little bit around where the bee makes their entrance, but it is often easy to see these piles of tiny little pieces of the dirt dug up from underground, and you might even see the bee going in and out. And bees, these digger bees, often they will often be found in great numbers in a given acre of land. Say you'll find a lot of these different piles of digger bee refuse outside their hole, and they will are solitary bees, so they are not a colonial situation, but they often, many of them will make holes in the same area. They are reported to be really good pollinators. They're small bees, not like the carpenter bees. They're tiny little bees. So they can get their way into small flowers, and they're pretty good pollinators of crops like cherry tomatoes, for example. They know how to vibrate those flowers with that buzz pollination technique that I mentioned. And so they're very good at showering pollen from one cherry tomato flower to the others. And they do, as I mentioned, nest in the ground, often in large numbers. So now we have, again, back to the squash bee. Here is a male and a female, and they are again covered with little hairs, which will collect the pollen and make them very good pollinators. Males will sleep often in the squash blossoms at night. The squash blossoms, remember, close up at night, so the males will sleep in there and wait for the females to arrive first thing in the morning. And squash bees are early risers. As I mentioned before, that's one of their techniques that they use to beat the honeybees to the situation. They begin pollinating the blossoms first thing, as soon as they open in the morning, and squash blossoms close fairly quickly after a couple hours. So time is crucial, and they have their early morning advantage to getting those squash blossoms pollinated. Here is, again, a picture of the squash bee and some flowers that they will pollinate. This is zucchini up here on the top, male, again, with the long, skinny stem underneath, and female, where the zucchini itself is forming. And down at the bottom is the pumpkin flowers, which we showed you before. Now let's meet the mason bee, or the blue orchard bee, better known as bob by some entomologists. They look sort of green, but out there flying around the flowers, they actually have a blue cast to them. They're very, very pretty little critters. And how do they get their name? They build a nest. This happens to be in a man-made sort of a straw that they cut in half so that you could see the inside. They will crawl into a long, skinny opening of any sort, whether it be in a tree or in a brick wall or a mason bee house that you make for them. And they will crawl all the way to the back, which is closed off, and they'll lay an egg and leave some food, a pollen ball for the babies, and then build a wall, and then another egg, and then a wall. This is out of mud that they will build, and they allow the wall to dry in between laying each egg all the way out to the front. And then they put at the very front a mud plug so that nothing can get in to harm the babies. That's how mason bees get their name. This is an example, and I'm not going to go into this in huge detail because there are a huge number of websites to tell you how to make a mason bee house. I don't have a lot of time today to dwell on this, but there are some details that you need to know. You need to keep it waterproof with a roof. You need to make sure they're closed in the back, that the holes are drilled exactly the right diameter, which is 5/16 of an inch. This is a side view. And there are various different specialty techniques about how to raise them, but those are easy to find, and I encourage you to give this a try. Now, this is a bee mimics, or flies in every case here. These are pollinators as well. They look like either bees or wasps. And again, they carry the pollen on a brush underneath the abdomen. They are very good pollinators of cherry trees and apple trees. If you happen to have any in your yard, look this spring whenever it's a beautiful sunny day and they have flowers. There'll be a lot of flies on those trees. Butterflies also are known as pollinators. They are actually not very efficient, and I'll bet you can see why. Look at the length of these legs. Their legs are so long that they hold the creature up above the flowers, so their body does not come in contact with the pollen from those flowers, so they're not as efficient at moving pollen from one flower to the other, but they're beautiful and they do some pollination, so we will certainly give them credit. After dark, we have the night shift, which are the moths. They have a lot of different pollinators and they're very good at it. This happens to be the adult moth of the tomato hornworm. You don't very often see these guys. They're out at night. You see the babies all the time if you happen to have tomatoes, but that is the adult. And you have here the hummingbird moth. This is a sphinx moth, and this is the hummingbird moth. And you have little ones and big ones and pretty ones, a lot of different kinds of moths, mostly again out at night. And of course, I couldn't leave out the bat. As you can see, their head fits just perfectly into this flower from the agave plant. So without the moths pollinating these flowers from the agave, we wouldn't have tequila. So I definitely have to give them their credit. We also have birds, hummingbirds, doves, various different kinds of birds that are pollinators. The hummingbirds have the long bill and their long tongue, which will reach into these long, thin flowers, which have pollen and nectar in there that they manage to move from one flower to the other. And they're pretty good pollinators and very fast. So we want to give people an idea of how to attract them to your yard, because we all want to help do our job to attract the pollinators to our area. It benefits both the natives and the honeybees, and there's a few main things that you can do. First of all, let's all hopefully learn to appreciate California native plants. I know in the next couple of weeks, we're having a lot of several talks coming from the master gardeners on bringing California native plants into your garden. So I hope you will tune in and listen to those as well, because it's a really important thing to learn for the benefit of the pollinators. Avoid the use of pesticides wherever you can. Plant a variety of flowers. I'm trying to encourage you to have sequentially flowering plants, so that hopefully at least up here we'll have hopefully at least 3 seasons with flowering: spring, summer, and fall, even if we don't necessarily have winter flowering plants. And don't forget the grasses. Ornamental grasses. I'm not encouraging you to plant a lawn, but ornamental grasses definitely have a lot of pollen and are very helpful to this whole idea. Here are some pictures of some of the things, especially the natives, that you can encourage. The native Sierra penstemon, the ceanothus, the yarrow. You can get the native yarrow, and there are various different hybrids as well. The Sierra lupin, the Arctostaphylos or manzanita. This happens to be one that's in my yard. Beautiful little pink flowers on those plants in the spring. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, and the insects love them. And here are some more. Blue-eyed grass. This was a little native that happened to be a big swath of native flowers that you saw next to the almond grove a couple of slides ago. Blue-eyed grass was a very important flower in that patch. It's a wonderful flower for bees. So is California buckwheat and California flannel bush or Fremontodendron. Now this plant can get really, really big, so you do have to be careful where you plant it, but it's very good for bees of all sorts, as is the Matila hapapi, which can also get very huge. So again, be careful where you plant it. Now I am encouraging you to plant a pollinator garden. This is a big one that says down at UC Davis, and it has an acre of plants. Now we aren't all going to have that kind of time or water or the ability to do that, but it's a really good idea. They have, again, sequentially flowering plants, which down there flower all year round. we have various flowers that are flowering at different times of the year. This happens to be a smaller garden, which is a wonderful little thing to plant for curb appeal at your house. And even if it's only a small garden, this happens to be in my backyard. It was a 3 by 3 foot box that I didn't have anything else to do with. So I filled it with soil, and I've got Santa Barbara daisy and lamb's ears, catmint, and the sticky monkey flower, which is this yellow plant, a native plant, which is wonderful. The pollinators love it. And here, this is bee balm or monarda, and it blooms at a different time of year. So I didn't get it in this picture, but I took a picture of it separately. Now, here are some absolutely fantastic books. I hope you can at least maybe get them from the library or borrow them from a friend or buy them all, because they're absolutely great at attracting native pollinators from the Xerces Society. Bringing Nature Home, which is a great book by a gentleman named Doug Ptolemy, who is a professor back east. And that whole book is trying to explain what is the benefit of gardening with native plants. Since he is back east, he is probably a little bit more concerned with the native plants that are present back there. And so that's mostly what he talks about. But the whole idea of gardening with natives is treated beautifully by that book. So I hope you will get a chance to read it. This one is California Bees and Blooms, which helps identify pretty much every pollinator and the flowers that they like the best. As far as websites that you might be able to enjoy, this is the Nevada County Resource Conservation District, which has a whole section of their website devoted to pollinators. If you aren't getting all of these things written down, don't worry, because as Sylvia mentioned at the very beginning, this talk will be online on the Nevada County Master Gardener's website. And so all of these slides will be there. You can write down everything that you want. Another website would be the Xerces Society, xerces.org, which is a fantastic group of people whose whole time is devoted to the conservation of invertebrates, all invertebrates, and a great deal of their website is devoted to pollinators. We also have wildflower.org, which is a center, I believe, in Texas, which does a lot of descriptions of beautiful wildflowers and what to do with them. We have CNPS, the California Native Plant Society, and that one is the one at the top. And then at the bottom, of course, our own website, the UC Master Gardeners of Nevada County. If you can't find what you're looking for on any of those websites, you can do a Google search for whatever you want to know. Try to stick with the university websites if possible, whenever you read up on a given subject. And so I want to say just these few things to remember. For every fourth mouthful you eat, thank a pollinator. And for all the hardworking, history, long-suffering, poor little guys, remember what it takes to give you almonds, almond milk, almond flour, almond sweet rolls, and almonds to eat, which everybody loves these days. Now try, at the end of this talk, when you go on to your gardening whenever it stops raining, just try one new thing. You can build a mason bee house, plant a pollinator garden, reduce your use of pesticides, whatever you can. It will help, I promise. And all the pollinators will thank you, as we do too. So thank you very much. This is the end of my talk, and back to Sylvia and or Margaret.
Thank you, Bonnie. Trying to make sure I unmuted myself before I started speaking. It's always a great presentation from you. So we really do thank you so much for sharing all your great knowledge.
Thanks. I've got to say to the people that are still there, I miss you. I really enjoy giving talks to people where I can see them, and all of us miss the gardeners of Nevada County. So hang in there, stay with us. We'll be back. We miss you guys.
Agreed. It's, you know, when you're trying to just do it to a screen, there's something when we're in the audience that there's an energy and an interaction that always helps our presentation. So thank you, Bonnie, for hanging in there with us, and thank you to our audience. So as to a couple question, one of them is, what would be the most deer resistant plant if you wanted to start with something for our area that would be good for the pollinators?
Pollinators. Okay.
So you could do two things, pollinators and deer resistant.
Right. That's probably a very important question. One thing, I know that the Matilla poppy and the Fremontodendron, the those great big yellow plants that I mentioned earlier, that I mentioned the size, both of them are very good with regards to deer resistance. Both of those plants are present. Actually, no, the Fremontodendron is present at the Master Gardener's garden, so that you can go down there and check them out and see what they look like. And as a matter of fact, if you go to the Master Gardener's garden, just notice, please take note, that it is not fenced in. The deer walk through that garden every night. So anything that you see growing there is deer resistant, so that you'll be able to take a look and notice that they definitely are deer resistant. Now, the biggest deer resistant pollinator plants would be lavender. Lavender is a wonderful pollinator plant. It's covered with bees in the summer whenever it's blooming, and the deer won't touch it. So that is a really good one. Rosemary is another one. Now, they don't bloom quite as long as the lavender does, but it's a really good pollinator plant. And again, the deer do not like it. Anything that smells strongly, they really don't like. So that's one way to think about it. Just a couple suggestions. And when you look at the little tag on your trip to the nursery, it'll usually say deer resistant. And the nurseries around here are real good experts at what the deer will eat, because that question is asked of them all the time. So be sure to ask them. Great,
thank you. So another comment is, great talk. I have a plethora of cutleaf bees that decimate my newly leafing pears each year. Anything besides pesticides I can do?
Now, you're talking about the leafcutter bees. Are you sure that that's what they are? Because whoever you are, I hope you're listening. I also have, you said pears, right, Margaret?
Yes, she did say
pears. Right. I have several pear trees myself, and I know I have leafcutter bees in the yard, and I've never seen them on the pear leaves. I do have other critters that will eat the leaves of the pears, and I have diseases that will eat the leaves of the pears, but I've never seen that special little round hole that they make. Now, maybe you have, and that means that that's what they are, because that's pretty diagnostic. But no, I'm afraid that's probably not something that you can get rid of. I would think that probably, even if the leafcutter bees take some pieces out of those leaves, there'll still be enough leaves left to give you a pear crop. And they're not going to be, the leafcutter bees aren't going to be there all summer. They probably would be there at the beginning of the summer. So probably that's when your pear tree is setting its leaves. But I would think probably that's not going to kill your pear tree. So personally, I wouldn't worry about it. If it is a huge problem, you're going to have to call us and we'll discuss it.
Okay, that might be the best thing. So she said they definitely are the leafcutter bees. She added a note. So
okay.
Then we have another question on, would you know the best time to start wildflowers from seed so that you can have wildflowers for our pollinators?
Well, that I hate to say this, and all master gardeners say it. That depends. That depends on what bunch of seed you are getting, and they have a lot of different wildflower mixes, bless their hearts, at the local nurseries. But it says right on each wildflower mix packet, it says exactly when to start them. Some of them would be better started in the fall because the seeds need to have exposure to the cold of a winter, and some would be better started in the spring. I would say probably springtime in general. You'll just have to scatter them and into whatever area that you are hoping to grow the wildflowers. And don't hope for a huge return the first year. You may have to scatter them several years in a row to get as many wildflowers as you're hoping for, but don't give up.
Okay. And then one of the things I was just going to add to Natasha's comment about the leafcutter bees is she can also contact our master gardeners through the website,
Yes.
you know, with a question and even mention that she'd like your help on that.
That would be wonderful. And what did you, Natasha, whatever, I think that's the name you said.
Yeah.
Send me a picture. Send me a picture of the leaves that, and I guess it would be at the beginning of the season, whenever you're seeing this. And I'd like to know what percentage of leaves on the tree have this problem. And did you have this last year? And did it affect your crop? That's sort of the things I would start with.
Mm-hmm. Great. And she says she will do that. So
Great.
If anyone has problems, remember, you can go to the website and look for the tab Got Questions and get started there. And as Bonnie said, add as much information, pictures, description as you can. So that's what's helpful. So, and Bonnie, I appreciate that you give us the tips that kind of get us started, that, you know, the 3x3 garden, the idea that, you know, these pollinators need something to eat all year long. So, you know, you can look up flowering plants at different seasons. So I think those are great tips. Thank you so much.
You bet. Absolutely.
Yes. So that does it for us. And in closing, we just want to thank everyone who have been here. We do appreciate that you hang in with us through this season. And at some point, as Bonnie said, we'll be back in our garden and at the Elks and be in person. So
right.
We say we'll see you next time, and thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.